Welcome to the debate on Press TV. I'm your host, Behruz Najafi. Narco-terrorism, that's what Washington is accusing the Venezuelan president of. It doesn't stop here. The United States is even offering $15 million for the arrest of Nicolas Maduro. Washington regards Maduro as corrupt and instead recognizes self-declared President Juan Guaido. Venezuela has already been grappling with sweeping sanctions on its oil industry. Now U.S. Attorney General William Barr is accusing Maduro of conspiring to, quote, flood the U.S. with cocaine and devastate American communities. The Venezuelan top diplomat reacted by calling the allegations unfounded and indicative of the desperation of the Washington elite. Now, what's behind this long-standing open animosity of the U.S. toward Venezuela? That and more questions will be the topic of our debate show tonight. Now, let me invite our guests. We'll have Professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the City University of New York, Danny Shaw, who's joining us from New York, and also former U.S. diplomat Michael Springman out of Washington, D.C., over the phone, I believe. Now, let's go to Danny Shaw first. Danny, Venezuela is a sovereign country. On what ground does the U.S. find itself eligible to want to intervene and decide about all aspects of life in that country?
Yeah, this is ridiculous and aggressive and brazen even by imperialist standards. This is the same government who invaded Latin America 200 times in the 20th century. This is that backyard mentality that Trump perpetuates as though, it was the 1800s or the 1900s still. And America thinks that they can invade and regulate the affairs in the Caribbean, in Central America, across Latin America. But at the height of the coronavirus, with so much fear and so much suffering, I'm here in the epicenter of the coronavirus in New York City, how absurd, how arrogant for them to continue to want to dictate what happens in Venezuela, and of course with Venezuela's immense oil resources.
Mm-hmm. Now let me ask Michael Springman. Michael, Washington claims that the Maduro government is flooding America with cocaine as a weapon in order to undermine the health of American people. How serious a threat could this be, even if it's true? Are drugs finding their way into the U.S. only through Venezuela?
Hardly. Venezuela is a good distance away from the United States, and if you wanted to move anything by land, you'd have to go through Central America and Mexico to get to the southern United States. Mm-hmm. Unless, of course, you've used fleets of small boats or submarines or aircraft from Venezuela, but the United States government has set up a series of airborne radar stations connected to balloons, and they have a number of patrol craft flying low-level surveillance. So I think this is more than a little nonsense, and I think what they really ought to look at is the American government's involvement in bringing drugs to the United States through Iran-Contra and other situations that Gary Webb detailed in his book about this. And they simply don't want to deal with reality. They like to fantasize and give their fantasies to the American people, who unfortunately are quite willing to accept them, just as they accept the nonsense that's being passed out about the coronavirus.
Now, Danny, does this allegation of narco-terrorism conspiracy really have to do with the health of Americans? Is it not another ploy to oust Maduro?
Well, as Michael said, one of the biggest importer and exporter of drugs has been the U.S. government itself, well documented by Gary Webb and other journalists with the Iran-Contra affair, which every student of American history should study in depth. And of course, the Colombian government and Ivan Duque and the 8 U.S. military bases in Colombia, another 10 U.S. military bases in Panama, even though we're told that, the Panamanian Canal is now in the control of the Panamanians. But the U.S. continues to have military and economic colonies dot South America, and that's the true crime of Nicolas Maduro and the Bolivarian leadership. And that is what the U.S. power structure cannot forgive. So at the height of this pandemic, that they continue to ratchet up aggression economically and militarily and threats against Venezuela, it's almost unfathomable.
Now, Michael Springman, what type of a government in Caracas is desired by the United States?
Well, what the Americans want is simply another pliable dictatorship that is capitalist oriented, does not like socialism, does not want to help its own people, very much like the American government does. The American government has no concern at all for the average fellow on the street. So they simply want an overthrow of a government that caters to the needs of the people rather than the needs of the oil barons and the corporate state.
Mm-hmm. And Danny, you know that Venezuela was already beset by a host of economic problems, and U.S. sanctions just exacerbated that. And the country's hospital system has collapsed, and this has caused the exodus of millions of Venezuelans. And on top of that, the country is also grappling with COVID-19 that's taken, you know, lots of human lives everywhere in the world, including in the U.S., which is now the, hotbed of COVID-19. So are the U.S. restrictions in such circumstances not tantamount to crimes against humanity?
They are indeed crimes against humanity. And one day, these leaders who think that they're invincible will have their day before history, and they will be judged and condemned by history, and the people of the U.S. and the people of the world anxiously await that day, and we organize for that day, most importantly. Right now, again, at a time of such heightened suffering, that this is the focus of the State Department shows how out of touch they are with the needs of the U.S. people. As the Cubans and Chinese offer medical internationalism and help, what does the U.S. offer? More invasions, more threats, more occupations. It lays bare once and for all the capitalist system, the imperialist system, and how bankrupt morally that it is.
Now let's go to Michael Springman. Michael, President Trump in his State of the Union address recently called Maduro an illegitimate ruler and a tyrant who brutalizes his people. Is it the job of the Venezuelan people to decide about the rulers or that of the White House?
It's the job of the Venezuelan people themselves, and I think Trump is using this obsession with the coronavirus to mask his intentions and his operations. He knows the Americans hear nothing on television and see nothing in the newspaper except the coronavirus, so he figures he has an open hand in doing anything to Venezuela he wants to because nobody's paying attention to anything anymore. So I think that this ridiculous business of recognizing this Guaido as president of Venezuela when he's never stood for election is unbelievable, except in the case of the United States, which backs all sorts of would-be dictators or actual dictators.
Mm-hmm. Now, Danny, you know the U.S. Has a long history of intervention in Latin America. It has done regime changes there, and there are some instances. You can mention some countries like Chile, Nicaragua, Argentina, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. These are the ones I remember. What has made different American administrations poke their nose into Latin America and topple or install governments there?
Yeah, as Mr. Springman said, they're looking for pliable neo-colonial regimes, and that's why they have Guaido as their puppet there. I mean, Guaido should be ashamed, debe tener vergüenza, to say it in Spanish, to be a U.S. Puppet, as well as the dictator of Panama and so many other lackeys that the U.S. has used over the years. So when direct control doesn't work, they resort to neo-colonial indirect control. And really, I think it's important that the American populace see critical media outlets, whether it's Counterpunch or Liberation News or Press TV, and get another viewpoint and really study Latin American history and see these countless human rights violations and violations of Latin American self-determination. It all began in 1893 with the colonization of Hawaii, then 1898, the recolonization of Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Cuba, and as I said earlier, 200 different military interventions,
right.
The length of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Now, Michael, let's have also your opinion about this. The reason behind America, no matter who at the helmets of the White House, the country has always been embarking on regime change and doing whatever they can in Latin America. Why is that?
Well, I noted in my book, Visas for Al-Qaeda, that the United States became deeply involved in Latin America simply out of capitalist profits. The United Fruit Company owned more of some countries and the countries themselves did. They simply exported bananas, and later it was minerals and other agricultural products that they could get very cheaply from the source, and then produce in the United States and make into something else and sell at a great profit. And this lined the pockets of American businessmen and American government officials. The U.S. State Department had a number of people in high positions there who also had high positions with the companies exploiting the Latin American economies. And they went into great detail about how they went into lined their pockets and where the money came from, and how they used their influence in the press and the rest of the American government to send American soldiers into the country and to essentially run them from Washington. They didn't like the government in charge because they might have wanted too much in the way of taxes. For example, in the case of Guatemala in the 1940s, they overthrew a dictator supported by the United States. And when Benz Guzman wanted to continue his projects and to make the Guatemalan people a lot better off, much as the Chavinistas have done in Venezuela, the CIA overthrew him in their second coup. So I think that it's basically money for the fat cats in the United States and influenced by American government officials to control the direction of where things are going. Look at Cuba. The United States had backed the dictator, and then he was overthrown by Fidel Castro and his group. And then all of a sudden, Dwight Eisenhower, the great peace-loving president, couldn't get along with Castro because he nationalized various American-owned industries. And suddenly, Castro was the enemy of the United States, and was so until he died. And his successors in the Cuban government are still the opponents of the United States and are enemies of the United States, as seen from Washington's eyes. So it's basically we want control, we want to dictate, we want to do it because we can do it.
Now, Danny, if you remember, Panamanian leader Noriega also received a similar indictment that was issued for Maduro, and that happened in 1988. The United States invaded Panama and removed him from power. What's the possibility of the same scenario to be repeated in the case of Venezuela?
Yeah, that's $1 million question. If Trump is again elected in November, I mean, right now everything is unclear with the coronavirus pandemic, but it certainly looks like they could try to militarily invade. And that's what they tried to do almost a year ago through the Colombian border. The Panamanian example is quite different because Noriega was a CIA asset. He was a neo-colonial puppet for a number of years. But then when he began to act with any modicum of independence from Washington, that's when they swooped in to make sure that the Panamanian Canal would be theirs forever. The 1989 Christmas invasion of Panama, to this day, the Panamanian debt have never been counted. Much like as a result of U.S. bombing beginning in 1991 against Iraq, and then the re-invasion in 2003, the Iraqis and the Afghanis and the Palestinians and the Libyans, the amount of death caused by these wanton, reckless U.S. adventures to this day, the victims have not been counted.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments. That's the end of this show. Let me thank my guest. We had Professor of Latin America and Caribbean Studies from the City University of New York, Danny Shaw, who joined us from New York, and also former U.S. diplomat Michael Springman, who joined us out of Washington, D.C. over the phone. And thank you for watching this program. We'll see you next time.